Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at NATO Allied Command Transformation's annual Chiefs of Transformation Conference. This, the 13th gathering of innovators from around the Alliance, all 29 nations, as well as the Alliance's partners. Our coverage here is sponsored by L3 Technologies and Leonardo DRS, and we're here on the trade show floor, as it is here at this conference, to talk to Professor Carlos Romero, who is the Assistant Vice President for Research at New Mexico Tech. You guys are working on some absolutely fascinating technology that talks about disinformation, Russian disinformation, the whole disinformation space, and you guys were a critical player in the Trident Juncture exercise. British Army Colonel Richard Blunt, and we interviewed him before about the experiment about disinformation and perception that ran as part of the roughly 24 experiments that were part of Trident Juncture. So first, Carlos, talk to us about ICASA, which is the Institute for Complex Additive Systems Analysis, and your partnership with a couple of companies, including Belgium's Clario, to build this extraordinary capacity you guys created to look at the information battle space in a way that's just incredibly eye-opening when you take a look at it.
So NATO was looking at how you can utilize big data at helping to characterize and inform the information space. So they created the study group called 225, and study group 225 developed a reference architecture to help throughput and figure out how data would flow through algorithms and other types of tool sets that could be developed. We took the work from the NATO study group and developed an experiment with some of our partners. So at New Mexico Tech, we have the Institute for Complex Additive Systems Analysis. That group is really a data science center. They've been doing that work for about 17 years, before data science became a word. So scientists, engineers, computer scientists, programmers, all work together at understanding large amounts of data and develop tools to classify and to organize those data.
And so, talk to us about some of the fundamentals and the secret sauce you guys bring to this extraordinarily contested battle space, because when you were showing me some of those graphs before we spoke, it was extraordinary that for each action or each statement that NATO was putting out, there was actually sometimes an even bigger counter statement in terms of determining the narrative and the public understanding of a very complex exercise that was aimed at the Article 5 defense of an ally. It wasn't an offensive operation.
Correct. So this is a great example of how NATO members can come together. So New Mexico Tech, a research university in the United States, work with Clario, a Belgian company that builds platforms. So the tool sets that we develop are not really out there in the cloud. Clario is an expert at building these platforms, so we worked with them. We also worked with other companies like the MMI agency in the United States, Semantic Visions in Europe, all to come together, and those are people that bring in the data. So what we did is we developed, utilizing the reference architecture from the NATO 225 exercise, actually developed some software tools that took in large amounts of data related to the information space. So Twitter data, video, audio,
print articles, video pieces as well.
Correct. All those types of data coming in, and then characterizing the algorithms, characterizing those types, whether it's NATO owned, whether it's hostile, it's NATO positive or NATO negative. And then doing that in real time, utilizing our data partners and our strategic framework partner in Clario, in the platform, sometimes utilizing information that is only open to us. So how do we take stuff that has a certain classification and keep that behind a certain firewall and only report things in the aggregate? We're able to do that. So what we were able to do is, during this, look at what was going on in terms of the information space related to the NATO Trident Juncture exercise, and as things were really happening on the ground, then go in and see, was this negative or was this positive? Who was owning that information battle space? And that information in our experiment, we're feeding back into the strategic communicators so they could better analyze and look at the right articles. You're talking about thousands of articles, thousands of pieces of data that humans have a hard time processing that quickly. So the most important piece with all of our tool sets are the analysts, are those strategic communicator analysts that NATO has from the member countries, so they can go through and actually utilize those smarts in their head. But we just point them in the right direction. We help them characterize things that would take teams of people to do, and the machines can do that much faster.
How would you grade, as you look back on Trident Juncture, right? I mean, we heard a little bit from Sir Stuart Peach, Air Chief Marshal, Royal Air Force Air Chief Marshal, who's the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. We heard a little bit from General Sharpie and others. Admiral Nielsen talked a little bit about lessons learned from Trident Juncture. It's going to take a long time to assess those. But as you look at the information environment piece of this, how successful was NATO at getting its message out accurately? How successful were its adversaries and NATO's adversaries, and let's just say a fair amount of Russian DNA in some of these efforts, as we know. How would you grade the Russian efforts to steer the narrative in the potentially nefarious directions that they wanted to steer it into?
So when you look at the act, counteract, there was a lot of volume on the negative side, on the hostile side, trying to counteract anything positive that NATO was doing or the NATO countries were doing or the media that was reporting. So you would see this huge volume of negative, hostile information coming out, trying to counter the messaging of one NATO. And so I think it's the lesson learned from our side is we have to be able to act quickly, to look at where the adversary is moving and be able to counteract that and provide that real-time cycled information to strategic communicators and commanders so they can quickly counteract when there's hostile messaging. So I think that's one of the lessons that we'll be diving through the data in real detail at how our algorithms did. I think the analysts did a great job because they were able to, in a quick time frame, incorporate this new experiment of ours into their information space, which is very difficult to do. So they deserve a great amount of credit in this. I think the people from NATO and our strategic partners were able to put together an experiment in a really fast period of time. So one of the things that we learned is we have to be nimble. We have to be fast. We can't be overly bureaucratic, but we have to make sure what we're doing is correct. So having that testing and having data scientists on the ground and having a team of data scientists that can support NATO and the member countries in tools that they need in order to win the information space game.
But as populations become more skeptical, in some ways more conspiracy-minded, now you can find things on the net very easily that reinforce your biases. You don't want to look at objective information sources because almost everybody wants information sources that they agree with. They don't want to read things that actually challenge their assumptions. What are the challenges as we go into this? A lot of people get their information from social media. They're like, well, my friend Carlos sent it to me, so it had to be true, not recognizing that actually you may be a tassel on the lunatic fringe that's peddling in some of this stuff. So then, you tell 2 people, they tell 4 people, they tell 12 people, and then before you know it, the misinformation is out there. What are the ways to sort of counter some of these fundamental trends that we're seeing in terms of how people consume news and how adversaries want to take advantage of these internal societal divisions or other factors to their advantage?
So one of the things that we began to look at in our study was when does something actually trend? When does that become a snowball? When does that become something that people are really listening to? Do we think that is going to be an authoritative narrative? So we develop meters that actually help us do that. So we can say, to a certain level of certainty, we believe that this item is actually going to be something that becomes a big item. And you can now influence that from our perspective. So then we know that NATO can go in there and strategically communicate around that particular item in order to change the narrative in the public space. So that is what's really important, and you have to do that in a very timely fashion. So where the battle space has a time frame and how they operate, the information space also has time frames and how to operate. And so those are some of the things that we think that as we move forward from this, more research will help us hone in those tools so that you can counteract exactly what you were saying. My friend told me something is true, so therefore it's true. We can begin to predict that is going to happen, and that way NATO can own that space and can help inform positive messaging around truth, and that's what's really important here.
Let me ask you, though, a tough question, because right now one of the big concerns is that the state of the art of the technology is such that somebody could relatively easily fake you making an announcement, or Jerome Powell, or a senior political or military leader with faked video. I think in Trident Juncture, the Russians produced a fake video that then ended up causing a problem. How does everybody combat this when the technology now is available, it's not just on intelligence services, but people can produce fake videos of people that look extremely realistic, could cause some very, very significant effects, but are very hard to tamp down because people are going to be like, well, no, I mean, I saw the video, right? I mean, surely that happened.
So Vago, fraudulent information is something that we all should be concerned with. And when you think about fraudulent information that's developed, it's very hard to detect by the human eye. Now we can use machines and take a lot of different information space and try to develop that. But let's talk about how a rational person looking at information can help discern whether something is real or made up. You have to use all your senses just like you would anywhere else. Does it make sense? Does it seem real? Does the space around it seem like it's been created? Or is the answer too easy? So before you hit like or you share with your friends, dig a little deeper. Just because the headline says that Vago and Carlos went to Norfolk to paint the town red doesn't mean it's true. You need to dig down into that article and actually utilize a little bit of logic, just like we learned when we were in elementary school, and go through a process where you make a determination whether that is real or not. Now, we can develop technology to assist in that, but each one of us has to learn how to discern those realities, because it is very easy these days with the advancements of technology to use it for nefarious reasons, and we always have to guard against that. So use your logic, use your senses, and help discern what you're looking at is whether it's real or not, and then turn to others and question. We should always question information. And so that's a very important piece that we have to keep vigilant about.
And talk to us a little bit about what the Russians did in Trident Juncture, because it's really quite extraordinary if you think about what they did. You know, sort of explain what they did and what effect it had ultimately.
So in creation of hostile information owned by an adversary, they can create information that is not factually based in order to sway the information space, also known as other reporters or what we consider, quote unquote, the media, to tell a story the way they would like it told. So it's very difficult to counteract that, especially when something starts to trend and become known. And so things will then get seen as a balanced approach by quoting a source of news that was created as a hostile source, but then put on the same platform as something that really happened. And so I think even the media has to be very careful when they source information to know whether something was sourced as a hostile propaganda tool or whether it was real.
Well, and that was the instance with the fictitious report created by the Russians of a meeting that was allegedly happened at NATO. You know, talk to us about that particular incident, because that's really extraordinary.
So there's particular instances when things seem like they could be real. And in the particular case you're referencing, a particular meeting that had taken place, reportedly had taken place, but hadn't taken place. And the players seemed like they would have been real, but it was a hostile news story in order to sway an audience about activities of an organization like NATO. And so we always have to guard against that and to root that out, find out where those sources is. So it's incumbent upon reporters to ferret out their sources and see whether they're real or not. It's incumbent upon each of us to discern those particular pieces of information, because the adversary is very advanced in their techniques, and they utilize those techniques and study us and our behavior as humans, our behavior as reporters, as academics, in order to get us to believe information is true, even when it's not.
Does Russia behave one way with NATO allies and differently, for example, with Finland and Sweden, which are EU nations that are not NATO members? Do you see a different sort of strategic information approach to those countries than, for example, the rest of NATO?
Generally speaking, what we see is a more hostile approach to the non-EU members, but in order to sway the public. And so you see an information space that NATO is not together. NATO is tripping over itself. So in order to convince the public that they don't want to be a part of this organization. So you see a little different space, same type of reporting, but more targeted into membership and to association than you would to undermine the pillars of the organization, of the alliance, as they do with member countries.
And last question. In the main, right during the Cold War, we had the U.S. Information Agency has been demoted, was Voice of America, and a variety of other means, because we looked at this in a great power competition as a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was behaving as a nefarious actor globally in trying to undermine positive messages. That's why the United States would always focus on the messages of freedom and democracy and values, and use very sophisticated approaches to counter what at the time were somewhat more clumsy, but still remarkably successful in some ways, Soviet disinformation campaigns. How many lessons are there about the Cold War that are applicable today, and how important are getting an entire alliance or a group of nations on the same page, so it's not just a military alliance, a military political alliance that's saying it, but that democratic nations? I think there are a couple of questions in there, but let me just take it any way you want to answer it.
So I think there's some great lessons learned from the Cold War time. So when you think about supported news media, what becomes the most apparent and what the West can show to the rest of the world is that when we have honest and fair reporting, and sometimes that honest and fair reporting doesn't shine a great light on what we do as people and as countries. And so I think honest and fair media and free media is something that we can show and demonstrate to the rest of the world. That's one of the lessons from the Cold War. When we look at not only the Cold War, but the post-Cold War times, when those news media organizations are the most critical of our governments, when they shine positive and negative lights on the truth, they become more believable. You can do a trend analysis and a viewership analysis on articles when it's not the most positive news, but it's the truthful news around the world. That will get views, and it becomes a trusted news source. So that's the thing we have to stand up for. That's the thing that I think one of the lessons that we learned from the Cold War is truth in reporting and the freedom of the press. That is paramount.
Professor Carlos Romero, the Assistant Vice President at New Mexico Tech, thanks very, very much, and especially for that strong support of a free press. As I've done this for almost 3 decades of my life, I always appreciate hearing it. Carlos, thanks very much. Best of luck to you guys. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and look forward to engaging next year.
Feliz Navidad.